Hello, my literary scholars. That means my really smart readers. Today we are going to read about George Washington. We're actually going to read about George Washington 2 times. First, we're going to read a historical fiction. Then, we'll read a biography. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to tell me the difference between a historical fiction and a biography. Okay, let's get started. So, what is historical fiction? Well, stories that take place in the past and are about real people, places, and events. But the story they tell about those people, places, and events, well, the story is made up by the author. So the people or events may be real, but the details about what happened, those were made up. That is historical fiction. So let's read the historical fiction One Winter Night about George Washington. Now remember, George Washington is a real person, but the story we are about to read is a historical fiction, meaning the author wrote the story, but we're not sure this is exactly how it happened or if it really happened at all. Let's read. One winter night, the winter wind rushed through the army camp. Timothy Wilson pulled his worn blanket tightly around his shoulders. All around him, soldiers huddled together as they tried to stay warm. By the light of the winter moon, Timothy could see the tips of his toes as they poked through the boot he was given when he joined the Continental Army. Even in the darkness, he could see the red stain seeping through the bandages he had tried to protect his injured foot. Okay, let's look at that first paragraph. So, we have Timothy Wilson pulled his worn blanket tightly around his shoulders. Well, that is telling us who this story is about. We know it's going to have something to do with George Washington because it's a historical fiction about George Washington. But our character right now is Timothy Wilson. That's important to remember so you don't think we're talking about George Washington just yet. All right, let's keep reading. As he carefully removed his boot to reapply the bandages to his foot, he heard noise off in the distance. Other soldiers rose to see who was coming into camp. It's General Washington. The message spread like wildfire. Soldiers rushed quickly over to see the great leader in person. General Washington. Is he president yet? Nope. This was during the American Revolution, before America became a country. Right before we became a country. Okay, it's General Washington. Many of them had joined the Continental Army to serve with George Washington, but they didn't see him as much as they wanted. Between leading the entire army and working with the Continental Congress, Washington was busy all the time. Timothy didn't care that his foot was not wrapped again. He wanted to see General Washington so badly that he shoved his foot into the boot and limped toward the group. He left a trail of red in the snow with every step he took. So think about a famous person you would really, really, really love to see. Well, George Washington was kind of like a rock star of the time. Everybody wanted to meet him, even those that were seriously injured. Now I want you to ask yourself some questions about this. This is some great imagery, right? What did his foot look like? What was happening to him? What was the trail of red in the snow? All right, let's keep reading. As he slowly made his way to where the troops were gathered, he saw his hero, General Washington, sitting on his beautiful horse. The other soldiers stood silently as the famous general spoke to them. From the looks on their faces, they were in as much awe of their hero as Timothy was. When he joined the others, he was surprised that Washington stopped talking and looked at him. "You, young man with the hurt foot, come here, please. I would like to talk to you." At the general's command, every soldier turned and looked at him. His face flushed a bright red as Timothy slowly made his way to the front. Why would his face blush red? Could he be embarrassed to be called out in front of all of those people? Okay, so now he's hurt and he's embarrassed. He's in front of everyone by George Washington. You ever felt that kind of way? Let's see what Timothy does. The red trail followed him all the way to the general. Because of his shock and excitement, Timothy didn't even feel the pain in each step. "Young man, what is your name? How did you hurt your foot? Why is blood coming through your boot?" Even though he spoke firmly, the kindness behind his words couldn't be hidden. That same kindness shone in his eyes. So here is Timothy's impression of George Washington, right? What does he notice about him? He noticed that while he's still firm, he can see that he has kindness behind his words and kindness behind his eyes. So that tells us he thinks George Washington is kind. That's interesting. I'm Timothy Wilson. His mouth tripped over the words. "It's so nice to meet you, sir. My foot is fine. It's just the cold in my boot. There's a hole that's letting the snow in. It's not a big problem, really." General Washington's frowned as Timothy talked about his boot. He let out a sigh, and he turned to his assistant standing behind him. "I told Congress that we needed to buy new supplies for our troops. It is unacceptable that our soldiers who are fighting for our freedom should have to suffer like this." Okay, what does that tell you about George Washington's personality? Who is he caring about in this situation? Turning back to Timothy, the general said, "Would it be okay if my personal doctor looks at your foot? He's just over the hill. Please let him take care of that foot. Also, you look like you wear the same size shoe as I do. Can I trade you shoes?" This tells us more about George Washington, doesn't it? What is he willing to trade? And who does he want Timothy to go see? Both General Washington's assistant and Timothy began to protest. "But sir, you need your boots. Why would you give them to a soldier that you don't even..." Probably got cut off by someone. Who do you think stopped him from talking? Maybe George Washington? Let's look at that word that's underlined. When we see an underlined word in a text, we know it is a vocabulary term. It probably means that you may or may not know it. But when you read a story like this, it's something you should know. How do we figure out its meaning? You can use your context clues. You can use a dictionary, or you can phone a friend. Well, Timothy began to protest. Protest in this situation means to argue, right? "No, no, 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 I don't need your shoes." He's protesting. "That's nonsense," General Washington interrupted them. "It is not okay that this poor soldier is out in the freezing cold with broken boots when I have a warm place to sleep and plenty of boots to wear. Plus, A twinkle appeared in the general's eye. I want to see the look on the faces of every congressman's face as I walk into the next meeting wearing those boots. Maybe they'll finally see the need for more money for supplies for the troops. Come, young man, let's get that foot taken care of and into a new boot. This shows us some interesting information about George Washington, right? What was he going to do with that soldier's boots? Why would he do that? Timothy nodded without a word and followed the general to the commander's tent. As he sat down to let the doctor take care of his foot and try on his new boots, he knew this meeting and this gift were things he could remember always. Okay, remember, I wanted you to learn about historical fiction, and we used this story about George Washington. The question you need to answer is, what does the historical fiction text want us to know about George Washington? Can you think of words to describe the character George Washington in this story? Question number 2. Do you think the exact situation happened? Did this exact situation happen in a historical fiction? All right, I'll see you next for the biography.